Billy Creekmore, Chapter 7. There is news of Meek Jones, and on hearing plans for my future, I begin to believe the prophecy of bad luck in my life. All of us went to bed hungry that night, hoping that a night's sleep would change Mr. Beetle's resolve. But this was not to be. We warn't given nothing but weak tea for breakfast. Then Mr. Beetle sent us to our chores. For an hour or so he paced back and forth on the porch, sheltered from the rain, while he watched us getting colder and wetter. Finally he left, but it hardly made no difference, since hunger and rain had taken the spirit out of everyone. Sometime late in the afternoon Mr. Beetle marched us into chapel. Already I was nervous. We never went to chapel except for Sundays, and I was sick with dread, figuring that Mr. Beetle had decided to hold us there until one of us confessed to stealing from the kitchen, but I was wrong. In front of the altar was an open pine coffin holding the body of Meek Jones. At first all I could see was his profile, but I could tell it was him. My heart went cold, and all I could hear was the blood thumping in my ears. Using his preacher voice, Mr. Beetle announced that the thief had been found. It was none other than Meek Jones, former resident of Guardian Angels, who was found drowned not a mile down river, his body tangled in the roots of a willow, his head battered against the rocks. Around his neck was a white sack filled with stolen food and money, testimony to how God punishes those who steal from the hand that feeds them. The boy had run away from the glassworks factory, broken into the kitchen at Guardian Angel's Home for Boys, and was on his way with the stolen goods to who knows where. Evidently Meek had lost his footing along the river bank, but whether he was first dashed on the rocks and knocked unconscious or strangled into a faint by the straps of the sack before he drowned, only God could say. But let this be a warning to you boys, that your earthly acts determine the course of both this life and your everlasting soul, and if it were for me to determine, I would say that he was strangled by his sin. The grown-ups were gathered near the coffin at the front of the chapel. The preacher was there, as was Mrs. Beetle, Peggy, and Mr. Calder standing behind poor Meek. Mr. Beetle called for each of us to walk past the coffin to see what can happen to a boy who lies and steals and runs away from his responsibilities. Until then, I must confess, I was feeling greatly relieved knowing that I'd never be caught and the blame was thrown on someone else. But seeing poor Meek made me feel most dreadful and sick. His face was terribly swollen from the water, and the bandage around his maimed hand had fallen off. Mr. Beetle and the others were very solemn and stern. They stared at us with cold faces, as if we were somehow to blame for Meek's thievery and bad luck. Only Peggy was crying. She dabbed at her eyes with her apron and couldn't raise her face to look at us as we walked past the open coffin. The preacher called upon us to look deep within our souls, to humbly ask God to make us eternally grateful and forever worthy, so we'd never repeat the sins of Meek Jones. Then he gave one of his long-winded prayers asking God to forgive Meek for his many sins and wash him clean in the flames of purgatory so he could rise up to heaven. The way he put it, such a thing was unlikely, seeing what a low-down sinner Meek was. Afterwards he led us in a hymn, and back we went to the dormitory, Mr. Calder and Mr. Beetle flanking us, Peggy and Mrs. Beetle bringing up the rear. So it was Meek the whippoorwill was talking about, said Frank Vickers. I guess so, I answered, wondering if spirits really were starting to infiltrate my storytelling. It was just part of my story, not even a guess or a true feeling, and it turned out to be true. I was feeling right spooked at myself, and I wondered what kind of powers I really did have. Did you ever think it was going to be Meek? And who'd have thought he was a thief, said Rufus Twilly. The lights were out, but all of us was restless with terrible visions of Meek and the sad end he came to. Makes sense to me, said Walter Barnes, sour as usual. Once he stole a biscuit from the tin under my bed. Can't say I ever saw that side to him, replied Willis Dawson, who was the only one who could stand up to Walter, for they was the same size, although Willis weren't near as tough as Walter. I stayed out of the conversation for fear I'd spill out all my secrets if I started talking, so I made out like I was going to the privy, and out in the dark I went. Gusts of wind rattled the trees, making the branches toss their arms about as if they was wild. Clouds pulled apart, leaving patches of black sky sprinkling with stars. I stuffed my hands in my pockets, hunched my shoulders, and walked into the wind. At first it felt good to be alone, but then the wind stopped blowing, and I could hear the river rushing and gurgling over the boulders. That was the last sound Meek ever heard. only it was all around him, roaring and accosting him, filling his mind and pulling him under. Soon enough the sound of the water was filling me, and I felt certain Meek's ghost warn't resting peaceful. Maybe he blamed me for what happened to him, since I gave him the very sack that weighed him down. Maybe it strangled him when he fell into the river. Tried cluttering my mind by humming so I couldn't sense Meek's ghost or hear it trying to talk to me. I walked back to the orphanage away from the woods. Across the way I could see that the lights were on in the Beatles' dining room, so I crept over to my spying window. There was Mr. Calder and Mr. Beetle sitting across from each other. Each had a piece of pie, but neither was eating. It seemed that they were arguing about something. I leaned toward the window close as I dared, and I tried to hear what they were saying. "No, Mr. Beetle, your offer is unacceptable. I cannot pay for the boy's coffin and burial and then offer you a fee for providing a new apprentice. The company lost money on Jones as it is, and now we need another boy to replace him. I will not pay you the usual fee in this instance. I want you to provide me a new boy free of charge." "Be reasonable, Mr. Calder," yelled Mr. Beetle. He banged the table with his fist and made the dishes clatter. "I have agreed to allow the boy to be buried here, thus saving you the cost of transporting the body to the pauper's graveyard near Charleston. But surely you don't expect guardian angels to pay for his coffin and burial." "I do indeed expect it, Mr. Beetle. I do so because you lied to me when you first discussed him. You said he was a compliant boy, sharp-witted and nimble, a boy who could easily be trained. He was so clumsy he got himself maimed and then cost us the doctor's fees." They went on, arguing about who would pay for this and why the other owed that. It was easy to see Mr. Calder was going to win the argument. His voice was loud and firm, but overall he was less excitable than Mr. Beetle. Eventually they came to an agreement. Mr. Calder would pay for the coffin, but not the gravedigger's, and Mr. Beetle would provide another boy to apprentice in the factory without taking the usual fee. "And who will you be sending?" "His name is Billy Creekmore, a bright boy, a very capable boy, but quite meek at the same time." It felt like I'd just been struck by lightning. The cold shivers descended upon me and my heart started thumping. "Very well then, Beetle, our disagreement is settled. I'll come for the boy in a week," said Mr. Calder. You could tell he was pleased as punch with himself. He shook his head and smiled. He picked up his pie and ate it with his hands. Somehow or other I made it back to the dormitory. Don't ask me how, 'cause I don't remember. I didn't have to look deep in my heart to know that I couldn't survive life in the glass factory. The heat and the noise of the furnaces seemed like hell itself, and I knew for a fact that Mr. Calder wouldn't pay no attention to my stories about seeing spirits. He was a rich man who weren't about to pay for the coffin of a poor boy who worked for him. Seemed to me he'd be comfortable speaking to the devil himself. My heart started aching, longing for my pa to come fetch me. I was in a terrible fix. What happened to Meek Jones could just as soon happen to me, and I had to figure a way to escape.